1 minute, guys. Sorry. Ooh. One more second. Okay, so everyone, welcome. I thank you all so much for being here. This is by far, I believe, our largest like web event, most well-attended web event we've had to date. Normally we try to keep it a little bit more intimate, but I think, obviously in these circumstances we can't do that, but we'd like to continue to be in touch with y'all and to please stay in touch with our community as we're building it. So without further ado, I'll tell you a little bit about us, Sparks and McNeil. So Sparks and McNeil LLC is a limited liability, multidisciplinary entity that's focused, in 3 words, we're focused on research, education, and activism. We're a public interest firm based in Appalachia, queer Appalachian owned, founded, and operated, and we focus on empowering historically marginalized communities through activist scholarship, education, and content creation. So we also do editorial writing and consultations. That was our original kind of goal. In the midst of the coronavirus pandemic, we're a little bit less than a year old, actually. We're getting there though, and we've only continued to grow. And things have gone very, very well so far. So let's hope it keeps that way. But we've lately delved into DEI auditing and reporting, and we've been doing some research projects for various nonprofit organizations. So that's kind of the direction we're going in, as well as online education. So we would really love to invite y'all to check us out and stay in touch with what we're doing, because we're all about the community growing and the activism, and this is the lifeblood of who we are, and we love what we do. So generally speaking, I would say that we work with institutions to develop community visioning, issue assessments, and stakeholder interviews through our facilitation and strategic planning. Of course, we're available for consultations and any services we can offer. We love to collaborate. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us at either myself or Zane. And without further ado, I will let us go ahead and I'll hand it over to Zane, who can begin to tell you a little bit more about this event in specific and what we're doing. Oh, and please, I would encourage you, if you haven't already, to donate to our speakers, because that's the purpose of this whole event. So if you haven't done that, I would kindly ask you to do that for us. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Zane.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for attending this roundtable. I'm extremely excited. Like Matt said, this is going to be our largest event so far that we've had, and I'm super excited for all the speakers. A little bit of history of this is last summer, I facilitated a workshop with the Activist History Review, and if you don't know their work, I'd recommend looking them up. They have great articles. A lot of us also are involved in them. I was a previous editor with them, and I was on anti-carceral veganism. And so this was a relatively new term for me. I had been working with activist scholar Julia Feliz on a volume with queer and trans activism, so especially connected to its entanglement with speciesisms. And there was a chapter in that collection by Lee Kurtz on anti-carceral veganism. And it really got me thinking about how so much of the discourse around animal welfare is, you heard an animal go to jail, and really where that comes from, what that means. We had Justin Marceau and Lori Gruen, who are part of the webinar. And so from that, I was really interested in diving more into this issue and figuring out why this is a go-to power in discourse. Do we target more marginalized groups instead of recognizing the systemic intersectional injustices done to each of us, animals, non-human life, human life. And so I put together this collection that is still being written right now on vegan entanglements, on dismantling racial and carceral capitalism. And I'm lucky to be collaborating on the project with some of the speakers that you see today. And so without further ado, I will just go ahead and ask our speakers to share a little bit about themselves, their work, how they became interested in the connections between labor, veganism, and the carceral state. Riley, do you want to start? You're muted.
Classic Zoom. I'm Riley Valentine. I'm an LSU Ph.D. student in political science. So I became interested in this because with my work in political science, I'm very interested on intersections of injustice within neoliberalism and how they fit together, specifically with the carceral state and Foucauldian ideas of power disseminating. I'm no longer a vegan. However, when I was a vegan, I saw that within a lot of activism, there wasn't a focus or a recognition of the fact that perhaps the actions that people were taking were actually harmful and were actually discriminatory and hurting and feeding into white supremacy and hurting the people who are also being traumatized and are also vulnerable within the system. And so I was really excited by this anthology because I was able to integrate my work on care ethics as well as neoliberalism into looking at carceral veganism and how it is in fact an example of bad care by its funneling people through systems of white supremacy, both humans and non-humans, and ignoring the fact that when they're pursuing justice for non-human animals, they're forgetting the fact that human animals also require justice and aid as well.
Lukas, can you go next? We cannot hear you, but you are unmuted, so I don't know. While you figure that out, how about Jay?
Yeah, well, so hello, I'm Jay. I just graduated from the University of Northern Colorado with a master's degree in English. And while I was there, I did a lot of work with all the kind of modernist authors, you know, Jean Rhys, Virginia Woolf, and I have been since really trying to integrate some of the kind of anarchist and post-anarchist and post-structuralist ideas of the philosopher Max Stirner, who's somebody who kind of gets left behind in the Hegelian Germany era. But I've been trying to kind of bring his ideas to the plane of vegan activism. And yeah, so that's a little bit about me and my work. I'm a new writer. This is one of my first publications, and I'm really excited about it. And I guess to answer the question about how I became interested in the intersections between, you know, veganism, labor, and carceral state. I mean, I guess I started just like everybody else starts in high school, right? When you're an edgy little existentialist kid. And I was just like, I just want to live my life. And then you kind of realize through reading a little bit of like Marxist literature that capitalism makes it hard for people to do that. And it's like, oh, well, then maybe I should be anti-capitalist. And then you read a little bit of veganism in literature and you see like, oh, veganism makes it hard for, or anti-veganism, you know, speciesism makes it difficult for the animals who are also individuals to live the lives that they want to live just because they have desires, because they're living beings. And yeah, it's a little about me.
Thank you. Nico?
Right on. Can you hear me? Cool. Thank you, Zane. I just want to, I guess, begin with a quick thank you for Zane for really bringing us all together in this book project. Yeah, it's an issue that all of us are passionate about, and it's really cool to have such a cool forum to be able to share these ideas with Lantern. Also want to thank, I want to thank the speakers for joining us today, and I want to thank everybody in attendance. I mean, quite seriously, and like literally everybody on this call could be doing anything on the World Wide Web at this point, but you're not, you're here chatting with us, and that's pretty cool. So folk who are willing to spend their Sunday afternoons digging into this nitty gritty of systems of oppression are really my favorite type of people. I just want to honor y'all for being here. My name is Nico. I did my undergrad in international political economy and my master's in animal studies. In terms of how, and I've been an activist throughout it all. So I really began in the climate justice space. I used to work for 350 and Greenpeace and slowly transitioned my way into the animal advocacy, animal rights, animal liberation space. I currently live in what is now known as Berkeley in Ohlone territory. Yeah, I'm activisting pretty full-time out here and working with Harvard Law in the animal law school program. I guess last part, I'm really interested and passionate about like all forms of justice and all systems of oppression. I've really found my niche within the animal space, but I don't think it's separate. I really see these as all intersecting and us all working in our own ways to promote a better, more just and more equal society moving forward. And that's why I think spaces like this, where we're really unpacking those intersections and looking at how these systems synergize with one another, is so important. So I'm excited to have this discussion with y'all today.
Thanks. And Lukas, did you figure it out?
So can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, also thank you very much for hosting and for inviting me and for attending. My name is Lukas. I'm a master's student at UPF in Barcelona. And I came here because I was very interested in critical animal studies, and it was this whole new field for me that I wanted to explore. So I came here to study it, kind of jumping between communications and political philosophy right now. And my main topic of research going forward is animal resistance. So kind of the idea of the animals are not just suffering victims and those poor animals that we should care about, but actually they're fighting back all the time, and they're showing us that they're resisting all the time. And I'm curious in what kind of conclusions we can draw, or how can we use that? And for this topic, it was actually through my master thesis, which I wrote on the Guardian series that's called Animals Farmed. And there were all these stories. There were what I call the abuse stories, which always end up with trying to incarcerate specific workers. So it's usually workers that are filmed beating cows or pigs, and then they're kind of targeted, and they either are fired or even go to jail in the end. And this was always presented as this big win for the animals in those articles. And it always kind of sounded wrong to me. I didn't have the tools to really understand what was going on at the time, but then luckily I stumbled across this, the roundtable last year that Zain already mentioned. And suddenly things started clicking, and like I started to make connections. It's like, oh, now it makes sense. This is what we're talking about. And that's kind of where the journey began. And I started to look deeper into how prison abolition and the carceral system kind of plays into all the other oppressions that I was already looking at. So that's how I ended up here. Looking forward.
Yes, thank you all for being here. A little bit about me as a facilitator. So yeah, my name is Zain McNeil. I am parts of Sparks and McNeil, and then I use he, him, and they, them pronouns. I've worked with almost every animal welfare organization out there. I feel like now I've been doing grassroots animal advocacy since I was 14. I did my first petition at 12. And since then, I've worked in grassroots organizing, litigation, public policy, government relations around these issues. So I think to begin, it would be good to go over just a few definitions. We've thrown on words like carceral veganism, anti-carceral veganism, speciesism, and I would think it'd be useful to just try to figure out why speciesism is central to issues of white supremacy, colonialism, and capitalism, and kind of unpack these terms for people who might be new to them.
Well, so with speciesism, I'm not totally sure that I'm qualified to give like the most thorough definition possible, but in a general sense, it's just the marginalization of non-human creatures, right? Or else, and especially this is one of the most important part of the definition. One of the most important parts of the definition for me is that it's not always targeting the divide between humans and animals. Speciesism isn't always, like humans say animals equal bad. Speciesism has also, it's really obviously manifest in the way that we treat, our companion animals, our dogs and cats versus the animals that we eat. And it's speciesism is just the cognitive dissonance between those two planes of existence. Just the certain animals get treated well, certain animals deserve ethical consideration, and certain animals don't. And that's speciesism for me. And if I could also answer why, according to my understanding, it's central to white supremacy, colonialism, and capitalism, it's because, at least historically, where I see it, I view the animal as the archetype of the subjected being in humanity. Where colonialism is concerned, we will call, white colonizers will call colonized people, savages. stuff like that. They will equate them to animals. They will be okay taking the land away from them because they're not quite human. They don't live up to the Eurocentric view of humanity. In capitalism, you will see the poor, the hungry described as begging for scraps, equating them to like dogs or rats. And it's just wherever there's subjection, there is animalization also, in my opinion.
Thank you.
Go
ahead, Nico.
I can hop in. Jay, that was wonderful. Yeah, I think you said it. I think you said it perfectly, right? It's like speciesism is when we judge the moral worth of another based on their species categorization, which shouldn't really have a basis in our moral evaluation, just as racism is how we judge the moral worth of someone else based on their race, so on and so forth. Excuse me, Ath and Silko really writes pretty convincingly on this topic. And it really transformed my perception of the intersections of speciesism, white supremacy, and racism. And they kind of make the point that racism in particular is really enabled and built upon this idea of speciesism. And they argue that it's because that we see other animals as being less than humans, it creates this spectrum of humanity, like this spectrum of what it means to be an individual worthy of moral consideration, which is historically peaked out at it's like the white heterosexual cis male human, and then cascaded down there towards the animal. And so it's this human non-human divide that enables subcategories descending from there. And so they argue that if we can eliminate the distinction between human and non-humans, the ethical distinction between those, then all the other moral devaluations that fall in between those also fall apart. I imagine some other speakers are going to talk a bit more about the intersections of white supremacy, but I just wanted to talk about capitalism really quick. Really, like, capitalism as a structure is built upon and was enabled by the domestication of non-humans. So this idea of capital, it comes from cattle, right? So the whole idea of owning property originated with us owning non-human animals. The two are inseparable. And so it was with the agricultural revolution and the domestication of non-humans that property, cattle, capital evolved. And from there, that capital accumulation has thus progressed. So that's one thing, right? I think also is that both capitalism and speciesism depend upon the same mechanisms of rendering others as disposable, of valuing the worth of others as their economic output. So, and both function by exploiting the most vulnerable. We exploit the labor of workers, we exploit the labor of non-human animals. So like milk, for example, is the exploitation of a mother cow's labor. All these animal products are exploitation of the labor of others. So for me, like capitalism and speciesism, like it doesn't get more intersected. And I think so many of these issues descend from there. But I'd love to hear what everybody else has to say.
I think a lot of great things have already been said, and it's hard to add much to that. I think one thing also drawing from Afin Silko is kind of the idea that speciesism has kind of its theoretical problems also, because it's almost always introduced in a comparison. It's like racism or sexism. So it kind of borrows on our idea. We already know what racism is. We already know what sexism is. We have another one of those. And I think there's several problems with that. And especially when, as we have all said right now, these systems are so connected, and how human and animal as categories determine quite a lot of all of our oppressions that we're talking about today. So I feel like I'm a little bit more drawn to ideas such as animal oppression or anthropocentrism, just because it allows already in the term that you can say what counts is who counts as properly human. And of course, we know only a very small percentage of humans falls into that. And I feel like that allows us a little bit more flexibility, as we've seen already, like by calling it speciesism, we have to be attaching it to the species. And yeah, we like dogs more than we like chickens. But I feel like for me at least, anthropocentrism or animal oppression seem to capture that a little bit more. Then we don't have to start with speciesism is like the others and then connect them afterwards, but kind of see that they're already kind of part of a bigger problem that we have to analyze.
Yeah, I'd like to chime in with like I guess it's more responding to Jay, but also Lukas, that's a very important point, is that, you know, that connection to anthropomorphism and centricism. And yeah, that's a really important aspect of how we create these dichotomies. I think that it's important to recognize that a lot of this, right, Jay pulled on how the idea of, with white supremacy, historically, how we've categorized people as being less human is how they're similar to being almost, in our quote words, like animalistic. And a lot of that has to do with the idea that Western rationality and the way that we show rationality as speaking, thinking beings is the peak of being human, right? So a lot of it relates to this Kantian idea, which really revolutionized in that, like, you know, 18th century, and how that transformed the idea of human being, especially as colonization was starting to expand. All of a sudden, you're seeing people who don't think in the same ways that you do, the same capacities, the same actions. And that also connects to ableism, right? Speciesism inherently connects to ableism. John McDowell, who's a prominent philosopher of mind, talks about how we shouldn't care about animals, for example, like parrots, because they're just speaking. They're essentially, he calls them basically thermometers. They're just reporting the same way. And this argument is used a lot in ableism of why we shouldn't care for people who are differently abled, who are restricted by movement, because they aren't fully human. So speciesism and this stress on a rationality that is understandable within white Western conceptions is the basis for an immense amount of oppressions across the spectrums, which is why when we talk about, you know, holistic anti-oppression, you have to engage with speciesism, you have to engage with white supremacy, you have to engage with all of these things. So
Great, thank you all. Moving a little bit towards carceral and anti-carceral veganism, do you see a connection between the institutional treatment of non-human animals and the mass incarceration of marginalized peoples?
Yes. If I can start us off on a sort of post-structuralist Nietzschean Stirnerite example, I think that the proper way to look at anthropocentrism, some would say humanism, but I don't think it's nearly as useful a term nowadays. It was in the Renaissance, but maybe not anymore. But I think the most appropriate way to look at anthropocentrism is as a structuralism, which is to say that it constructs, it frames, it has an inside and an outside. And the properly human, you know, the ideal, the Kantian subject is going to be on the inside, the smartest person, the whitest male, whatever. And then everything else is going to be on the outside. And as with, you know, structural like systems of morality, what is on the inside is usually deemed worthy of ethical consideration. What is on the outside is usually deemed unworthy of ethical consideration. And to me, it's interesting to I guess first address criminal law in general, and then we can talk about you know, the incarceration of marginalized people and then animals too. But criminal law in general, to me, a human being is born into the structure of anthropocentrism. They are human, you know, they have human eyes, they have all the things that humans have. And as they grow up, our society kind of puts them to this test where it's like, are you properly human? Are you kind? Are you gentle? Are you ethical? Are you not a criminal? Are you going to contribute to society, etc.? And when the previously human proves that they can't do that, when they commit a crime, when they steal, etc., the judicial system, society will judge them as less than human, right? They're not totally ideal. They're not as good as a person could be. They don't fit the anthropocentric Kantian moral subject. And so they forfeit, according to our justice system, their rights to ethical consideration. We can lock them up for years and years and years, and we don't have to care, because they committed a crime, because they're not as human as human can be. The same is true with animals, I believe, except I think that animals are born on the outside of the construct always. You know, they don't really have their chance to move between the inside and the outside of like humanity and dishumanity and ethical consideration and moral consideration. The exception being like dogs, you know, where it's like if a dog shows kindness or friendship or anything else that we cherish in the human, then we're gonna love the dog. But if the dog shows brutality or animalism, you know, we're gonna put it down or whatever happens. Yeah. And I think to also speak, I know I'm talking for a long time, but to also speak to the question of the mass incarceration of marginalized people on the same topic. I think it's important to note that throughout history, throughout the construction of anthropocentrism and humanism, starting in like the Renaissance with people like Pico de Mirandola, you know, with their humanist manifestos, and people like Ralph Waldo Emerson, who will just write all their writings starting with like the great man must ... You know, those are all strictly European. They're all white. They're mostly males writing these things. So, you know, the construct, the anthropocentric good person, is constructed by European white male identity. It will be really, really easy for somebody to fall out of that identity just by being born outside of it or existing in a certain economic condition that is outside of it, you know? Yeah.
I think that distinction is really important because carceral veganism in its most simplistic breakdown, right, is a form of veganism that uses the legislative punitive arms of the state to protect non-human people, non-human beings. And that, as you point out, creates this dichotomy of people and beings who are safe and people and beings who are not safe. And once people and beings who are not safe, who have acted in ways that go against norms of what is good, gentle, etc., are then able to be exploited, and how Nico points out that relates to the origins of capitalism, right? So like I'm in Louisiana, I'm near a plantation that was converted into a private prison where prisoners labor and sell they're there for the rest of their lives. There's a rodeo at Angola prison. They perform for the people, predominantly white audience. Their labor is you know, profits the prison, and they are decidedly not human. They're outside of what we understand to be human. Likewise, within a nationalistic, a very hyper-American idea, is when you have undocumented people working at factory farms, they're expendable. They're not actually human because they don't follow within the ideas of being correctly Americans or not. They don't fall within this distinction.
Right.
So
They don't speak our language. Just like
yeah, they don't speak the language. And even if they do, they didn't speak it from birth. Despite the fact that many Americans' first language is not English and we don't have a national language, we still have these impositions. And so these threats still hang over people as though they are not human. And Gabrielle points out that, yeah, Louisiana state budget would fail without incarcerated people. Absolutely. You know, attending LSU after storms, the people who show up in labor and who clean up the grounds, make sure that it's safe for people to go, are prisoners. Prisoners who are seen as individuals who cannot be trusted to be among people because they are somehow more animalistic. So all of these things really fit together around who is correct and who is not correct.
I can sprinkle a little more on top. I mean, I think y'all already did such a good job. So yeah, I think like incarceration and animal agriculture are both really rooted in the same frameworks of control, and they both rely on the same technological manipulation of life. So Foucault refers to this as biopower, which he refers to as something along the lines of the power to foster life or disallow it to the point of death. So both of these systems cage individuals, control their movement, regulate their feeding, etc. both operate by hiding victims from the public eye. I generally I mean, it's against the law to take pictures of CAFOs and of animal agriculture, and our prison industrial complexes are also usually sidelined far out of the eye. And yeah, so they operate based on the same logics and based on the same technologies of power. And because of that, I think that deconstructing one really requires us deconstructing them both. So as like an easy example, like as long as we accept caging humans, there's really no hope for critiquing the caging of non-humans, and vice versa. So I think for all of us, regardless of like the center of our focus, we really need to be focusing on the ending of cages, the ending of prisons. And I think focusing on this decarceral logic contributes and empowers both movements.
Yeah, so I think one more thing we could say about especially the historical connection is I feel like there's a similar ideology or a similar idea that happens on both the carceral system and also animal agriculture, which is this idea of reform. And of course, for prisons, there's always prison reform. And Foucault and also Angela Davis point this out, that the prison system we know today is the history of the prison system is the history of prison reform. That the start of the prison system was a reform of previous, even more cruel punishments. So kind of all of these hundreds of years, several hundred years of the prison system are actually always reformed. So the two always go together, and prison reform never challenges the idea of the prison, of the carceral logic that we're talking about today. And I feel like there is something similar going on with commercial farming, with the animal industry, where animal welfare, the idea that of course we should treat animals a little bit better, we should still farm them and still kill them and still eat them, but of course they should be treated better. It goes so tightly together with the industrialization of farming. And I feel like there are several parallels here. On the one hand, both of them make it so there's no other way possible. So within prison reform, within the idea of course, prisons should be better. Of course, we should be a little bit nicer to inmates. There's no idea, there's no option that there could be a world without prisons. And similarly, in animal welfare, it's the same idea. Of course, animals should be treated a little bit better, but we cannot imagine a world without animal farming. This is unimaginable, it's outside. And I feel like if you look at the history, you find that those two kind of always go together and they never challenge each other. And they have a very similar narrative of course, it should be a little bit better. And this is also supported by wide parts of the population, because very few people would disagree that animals should be treated a little bit better. But they fail to actually provide any critique of the underlying systems like we're doing today. So I think this is also an interesting connection.
I think that's awesome. I want to tell you one more point before we switch topics. Just to Lara's point, who commented, I think I just wanted to emphasize it because it really resonated. I went to jail a few years ago for not for very long, but for liberating some ducks from a factory farm here in California. And I was just blown away by the number of inmates around me who had just worked on factory farms and slaughterhouses, but in particular, folks who had worked at the very slaughterhouse that I was arrested at. Like as soon as they found out, like people were just swarming from all parts of the campus to talk about their experiences there. And it's incredibly telling that the folk who find themselves in like situations that like lead to incarceration are also like there's such a big overlap between these folk and folk who are forced to work into factory farms and slaughterhouses. Like these are jobs that like nobody wants. There's absolutely brutal, horrendous jobs, and they're forced onto folk who don't have other like really solid options. So there's that overlap. And then again, as Laura says, then once folk are actually incarcerated, then they're then sent back to work on these farms for pennies on the dollar. And the last point I wanted to emphasize is that it's a global issue. The slaughterhouse that I did a lot of activism around and inside in Colombia, it was attached to a prison. So like there was literally the same entrance for both the slaughterhouse and the prison, and there was no separation between the two. So these logics, unfortunately, like a lot of these issues and logics originated here in the United States, but they've been exported abroad and magnified, and really they're endemic to so many countries now.
Yeah, and I feel like I've written a lot recently about the COVID pandemic and slaughterhouse and meatpacking workers, right? I feel like all of us have read those stories about how Tyson and other factory farming companies haven't been able to, have refused to care about the lives of their workers, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, and not put the safeties that should be there in place.
So I give an empirical note, just like in support of Nico, like in a common job that is given to, so refugees are guaranteed jobs in America. Typically the jobs are at factory farms. And when you talk to people who have those jobs, one, they're traumatized by them, but also they will say it's not as bad as being in a refugee camp. And so these jobs, which are horribly traumatizing, are put trauma on top of trauma. But at the same time, people are like, you know what? It's better to deal with this than to stay in essentially an internment camp for who knows how long. It's a global issue. It's a migration issue, and it's extremely cruel.
And so moving from this concept of precariously employed people, the prison industrial complex. So when we're talking about carceral veganism, single issue veganism, that really, especially in litigation, tries to prosecute workers for quote unquote cruelty cases, how does this contribute to oppressive hierarchies and systems of oppression? And then how might an anti-carceral veganism and consistent anti-oppression work destabilize and dismantle these hierarchies?
By individualizing the violence of the workers from the violence of factory farming, which is throughout America, it allows us to focus on individuals rather than the systemic issue, right? And that's a big thing that happens just in general in a lot of organizing, is when you focus on the individual who is doing direct harm, who they should not be doing that harm, of course, in general, it allows us to not think about the fact that factory farms are doing this large scale and en masse. It allows us to not think about why are workers specifically going into these factory farmings? What are the structures of support that enable this to continue? And why is this so integral to the American economy? And it allows you to not look at that. And so when we talk about anti-carceral veganism, it's looking at all of these factors that combine to support that, you know. So it would mean thinking about the injustices of making it so that felons can't get dignified, reasonable employment. It would mean looking at why are we able to think about some animals as being worthy of protection and others as not being worthy of protection. It would make us think about why are factory farms able to bully undocumented people into working for them and holding their green card status over their head with a threat of violence? What are these other issues that are going into that? And so an anti-carceral veganism attacks all of these systems of power. And by not having a single issue, you can't actually end speciesism and you can't end factory farming if you're not dealing with any of these other issues that fundamentally support it. If you don't attack the way in which we think about borders, there's still going to be ways to have folks employed violently. If you don't undermine carceralism, it's still going to support that. So they all intersect together.
Yeah, totally. And I just, that was brilliant, by the way. I just have one other tiny thing I wanted to add to it, which is that, yeah, I think that you, at the very beginning of what you were saying, you spoke to the individuation of crimes against animals, you know, really centered in and focused on factory workers. To me, that's just insane. It's like oh, inside echo. To me, it's like as if the the demand that puts the workers in the positions to even accidentally hurt animals in ways that could be photographed and used against them in criminal cases isn't generated by like 97% of the population, there's no room for individuation. There's no room for individuation in veganism. No.
And I also feel like the way you put it, Riley, that the farm owners are bullying the workers and like threatening to call them. And it seems like carceral veganism is just bullying those same people. And as we've already said, individualizing them. And I feel like there might be some part of this can be explained by they're just easier targets. Like politically, they're easier targets. They're already getting bullied. So we just become another bully. And it is not that hard to get one of them fired or sent to prison. And then I'm very interested in how, as an NGO and a welfare NGO, for example, we can use that as a win for the animals, which is really ironic because many times this doesn't change anything for the animals. As discussed, like those jobs are super precarious and easily replaced. So getting somebody new into this job doesn't change the situation for animals at all. But instead, I feel like it gives a sort of a success story, and it gives a story that we can put in the newspaper, that we can write reports about. It's like, yes, 1 more or 5 more people got arrested, justice for the animals, justice was served. And then of course, we need successful campaigns to attract funding, to become popular, to run advertisements, etc. And it seems exactly this idea that we have to have these campaigns, these winnable campaigns, and they're really hard if you go for big structures. Like fighting animal oppression is hard, closing a factory farm is hard, but tackling one specific individual is way easier. And then we can make a big story out of it and sell it and get more support for our future campaigns. So I feel like this can maybe help explain it. It doesn't excuse it, but it helps explain it.
This won't really add anything. You three just explained everything. But I did want to just plug Justin Marceau's new article they just published in the Harvard Law Review. And he talks about a week ago, and he talks about this as palliative animal law. So the idea of like palliative care for humans is like addressing the pain, but not addressing the issue. In the same way, like this focus on targeting marginalized workers and prosecuting individual workers makes us as a society feel good about what we're doing. We're making progress, we're addressing these injustices, and allows us to kind of pat ourselves on the back, but it doesn't address any of the issues. And on the contrary, it really helps to ingrain and enable these issues moving forward. So yeah, I really do think that like the focus on prosecuting workers is a distraction, especially when the movement has very limited resources, both in terms of people power, but also like just in communicating with the public. It distracts from the real issues. It enables the deep systemic issues to continue, and honestly gives them validation and credence. So I don't think whether it's legal or just in movement rhetoric, I don't think we can really be making progress societally and systemically without getting rid of the focus on individual workers and shifting it all into the corporations.
And in Marceau's text Beyond Cages, he talks about how it's much easier, right, with the system. So much of factory farming and the cruelty and normalized violence of that is not part of cruelty codes. And so you can't actually sue what's normal agricultural practice. And so with my background in animal welfare organizations, it's usually actually less from criminal law perspective than the communications department that see this race baiting, this like very much like dog whistle politics for development, for fundraising, who are trying to use white supremacist language in order to get funding, which is inherently super, super problematic. So going into that, just a last question is, what would an anti-carceral vegan model of restorative justice look like? And then any ending remarks you all would like to do.
Well, so incredibly important question, because it's so incredibly difficult to answer, right? Because the movement, if we can call the vegan movement a movement, and I think we can, is so young and so fresh. It's difficult. It's difficult to kind of project so far into the future. But therefore, I think it's important. And I don't have a super clear answer in terms of projection, but in terms of mindsets moving forward, I think it's really important, as we can maybe gather from all the points that are being made here, that the vegan movement and veganism focuses on, emphasizes deconstruction at this phase, rather than really emphasizes like, solid concrete steps and progress, because so often, those things that are given to vegans and given to animal activists as progress, like we've been saying, have been, distractions, and have been things that really don't move the movement forward, but just get one worker out of the line of workers, and then another worker comes in and nothing really moves forward. I think it is a vague answer for sure, but I think my vision of the future of restorative justice and veganism together emphasizes deconstruction, emphasizes just attacking the corporations, like we said, mindsets which allow speciesism to flourish, etc.
Yeah, I think, like you already said, Jay, it's a very difficult question to answer. I think the first thing that comes to mind is just that we have to keep in mind the socioeconomic context, and we cannot individualize, like we said this several times, but I feel like it just has to be the base of it, because if we don't do that, everything else will fall short. Like if we don't understand how capitalism, how class relations work, and all the other oppressions that we talked about, it just will not make sense, and it also will not look like a social movement, like a progressive social movement, at least. And I think in kind of looking forward, I just think it's important to provide alternatives, and provide alternatives in the sense of transitions, of transitioning farm operations to vegetables or fruits, and also just like create other meeting places between humans and non-humans, and kind of a more peaceful manner. So I'm thinking more about animal sanctuaries, where our relations are challenged. Our relations of what is an animal, what is a farmed or food animal, is challenged, and kind of trying to be a little bit constructive, as in what can this future world look like. For sure, there will be still a lot of non-human animals around that used to be the farmed animals, and trying to build those new relations with them, caring relations. I think it will have to happen in like these places that are already partly existing, but of course they have to exist way more. And I think in these spaces we can look for other ways of justice, and other ways of fairness, and creating the future that we want to build.
I just wanted to emphasize really quick, you were talking about the, we have to just really keep in mind the socioeconomic conditions of the people in the places that we're trying to spread the vegan message to. I know it might be jumping ahead, but I think we got a question from the audience on like the Google sign up thing that asked about how the lessons that we're talking here can apply to people in, in the global South. People, I think the person who asked the question was in the Philippines with the just wildly fascist Rodrigo Duterte. Is that how you pronounce that? And it's yeah, just I think it's really important moving forward to emphasize for sure that de-individualization, and keep in mind the socioeconomic conditions of anybody you're talking to, because if you're going to live in a country like that who is just going to be like executing people extrajudicially just in the streets for doing drugs, it might be extremely difficult to try to eat vegan without giving off, pinko commie vibes or whatever, and raising suspicion from the government. And I don't know, I just de-individualization for sure. I just wanted to emphasize that.
All right, I know we're winding down in time, so I'll try to keep my answer succinct. In terms of Zane's question, in terms of like what an anti-carceral vegan model of restorative justice would look like, I guess like two things for me is shifting the focus, as we've all said, from individuals into systems. And I think like corporations in particular, I think focusing our advocacy against these corporate entities, these international corporate behemoths, creates a lot of opportunities for building solidarity with other justice struggles, whether they be worker rights or environmental rights, etc. I mean, there's so many. So that's one. And then I also think incorporating the struggles of other movements more and centering them in our movement makes sense a lot. It's like really important as well. So beginning to advocate more strongly for prison abolition ourselves, not as a way to support animal liberation, but as an end in itself. I really think that we need to be getting outside of our silos, getting active in these other spaces, and walking the walk and showing what solidarity looks like. I also just wanted to quickly mention Gabrielle's question, which I thought was really good. I can just read it real quick. They ask, how is this group thinking about the ways that ancestral practices are criminalized by mainstream veganism? For example, Chinese medicinal practices, religious practices, indigenous practices. So Gabrielle, I think it's a phenomenal question, something that's really important. I also think it deserves its own webinar, but I'll try to address it in like 30 seconds by plugging other people who have addressed it. So Claire Jean Kim has a wonderful book called Dangerous Crossings, and they discuss a variety of these kind of different types of practices and the conflict between animal rights activists and these historical practices. And what she advocates for is this practice of mutual avowal or mutual disavowal. And so the idea is it doesn't have to be a binary yes or, but we can be advocating for maintaining cultural rights and respecting like cultural rights without violating the rights of other marginalized groups, in this case, non-humans. Gruen has a really phenomenal article, it's like really short, it's like 4 pages, that talks about cultural relativism in the speciesism context. It's called Conflicting Values in Conflicting Times, or something along those lines. And I mean, she's an ecofeminist and has done a lot of work with feminism in cultural relativity and applies it to cultural minorities and their practices. My personal thoughts are that here in the US, as a US citizen, I'm predominantly focused on majoritarian practices. So when it comes to eating animals, I'm focused on eating pigs, chickens, and cows. I'm less focused on minoritarian practices of eating like turtles or things like that, because I want to focus on the biggest issue that the culture that I was born into is advocating. Same with entertainment. Like I'm very vocally against rodeos, for example, because they're this majoritarian practice in our society. And I don't like, and while I'm also against dogfighting and cockfighting, I don't see a difference between dogfighting, cockfighting, and rodeos. As a US citizen, a white US citizen, I think it's most appropriate for me to be focusing the majority of my advocacy on the biggest issues that the majority of society currently supports. But would love to have another webinar digging into this topic in particular. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, so I guess I have thoughts about Zane's question and Gabrielle's question, which I'm really like, yeah, I love both of these questions. For Zane's, it has to be centered, of course, in anti-capitalism. It has to be focused in indigenous food sovereignties. It has to be focused in, so much of the land and family of my like farmers, a lot of my family are farmers, is so much of the land is poisoned and being taken up, not just by factory farms that for cows and slaughter, but also factory farms to feed them. And it's stripping the land of any actual usage that could be done to feed also human animals as well. It really strikes away the possibility for any of us to live without factory farming of either types. They feed into one another. And so we have to focus on food sovereignty as well. So it has to be a very anti-capitalist movement because until we tackle capitalism, we can't bring down factory farming. With Gabrielle's point, that's really important. So I am not vegan. I am a pescatarian. For me, I would say that question resonates a lot because, within like Cajun culture, dominant culture tried to minimize that and legislated against and made some of our cultural practices illegal. So I have a lot of strong feelings when it comes to, I guess, saying that some practices are okay and some aren't, because that can be very patronizing, right? Especially as someone who is white saying, well, indigenous people can do this, however, large scale white people cannot. So I think that's something that also has to be grappled with. But with Nico's idea, of majoritarian practices, I think that's a large scale focus. and needs to be grappled with. Roy says, how do we reach the right-wing population with the anti-capitalist sentiment? So I'm an educator, and I see a lot of my students who are more right-wing, who are much more open to discussing anti-capitalism than some of my more self-identified liberal students, because they often assume that they are very correct and that their mindsets. And a lot of my students who are more right-wing are acting in opposition to things like they're very angry at the oil factories that are causing mass cancer in Louisiana. You know, they're angry at these structures that are being given passes by the government and aren't being fully taxed and are doing these things. So there is a lot of mobilization there that I think is very possible. I think we just need to reconceive of how we communicate. Right? Like a lot of folks I've worked with for Mountain Justice in West Virginia have been Republicans, but they're very angry at the way that the mining corporations are talking to them, and they're angry at the way that they feel like they're being spoken down to. And so you can find ways of communicating. It's just at those intersections.
Yes, thank you all so much for being part of this. I'm going to have Matt lead the Q&A, and we're going to invite you all to unmute. If you'd like to, you can either put questions in the chat or go ahead and just have a casual conversation with us. But thank you so much for being part of this.
Yes, thank you all so much. And again, thank you guys for those great questions so far. We'd like to have a few more from y'all, but obviously, thankfully, we have a huge, amazing group, and there's so much to cover and so much we can talk about. So yeah, like Zane said, I would like to just invite you all to unmute yourselves, or if you'd like, you can type it into the chat, and I can like read it out to them or not, if you, as you like. But feel free. We're open space now. There's so many of us. It's really hard to control the volume. So go ahead. Feel free to unmute yourselves, guys. Don't worry, we're all one big family here.
All right. So I don't mean just any right-wing person. I mean specifically the people who are still believing in the Q conspiracies.
Oh, word. That's so I was doing some preliminary research on QAnon, and the people who primarily believe in QAnon, interestingly enough, some of them used to be Democrats who defected because they feel that multiculturalism and problems of racism were overblown. They're also usually very rich, and so they're pretty siloed off. So reaching them, I'm not sure, honestly. I'm not sure. That's like a very... Yeah, that's something that I struggle with, and I'm not sure.
All right.
I can take a swing at it. I'm gonna give two answers that are the exact opposite, and you can choose whichever one resonates. So I do think, for better or worse, maybe unfortunately, there is a large subsection of like animal advocates who buy into like Q stuff, and to conspiracy theories in general. And I think a reason because of that is that when you wake up to the oppression of non-human animals and you see it pervasive everywhere you look and you see how devastating it is, it encourages you to question everything about society, right? If you look at like major societal structures that are endorsing this unimaginable violence, it makes you think like, well, what else in society is broken? And I think it makes us very susceptible in a good way and in bad ways to conspiracy theories. But I also think it's possible to engage with these communities by speaking the same language, by finding things in common. So like critiques of power, critiques of corruption, and working from there. So that's one answer. The other answer is, in terms of organizing, there's what's called a spectrum of allies. I wish I had a whiteboard, but it goes from strong allies to strong opposition. And so the idea is that so strong allies, moderate allies, neutral, moderate opposition, strong opposition. And the idea of this spectrum is that as an organizer, we're trying to bring people over to our side into strong allies, but we're also trying to isolate strong opposition, right? So the idea is that we're not trying to win every single person onto our side. We're trying to win the winnables and isolate the people that are too far out there, because we don't need 100%. So an example of this, like the recent massacre in Boulder, Colorado, right? Like some of the hardcore NRA folk are coming out with pro-gun things right after that. It's an awful look, it's repulsive, and that's for anti-gun folks, that's good for us. We can isolate those people, and I have no interest in winning those people onto our side. The goal is to isolate the strong oppositions and then win over everybody else onto our side, and to create this polarization, this dichotomy. So I guess whichever resonates with you, we can win them all, or we can push the ones that aren't winnable. I fall, I guess, somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, I would say I resonate with what you said there, especially because I feel the same way in terms of I want people to understand that people in this movement need to understand, need to become more politically conscious. And it seems like they don't educate themselves in other things in terms of what else is, you're saying, they could be susceptible to conspiracies, but really looking into these issues in society, understanding where they come from, and then working from that,
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the reasons why just in this conversation so far, we've been using those terms like single issue veganism and carceral veganism kind of interchangeably, because, it's not a single issue. It's really, really not. People need to educate themselves about all of it.
Well, thank you guys.
I can take a swing at Amanda's, but I'd love for one of the other panelists to go ahead if it's speaking to you. All right, I can start, and then y'all interrupt me. For me, it really is a case-by-case basis. But in all these things, referencing back to Claire Jean Kim's idea of mutual avowal, I don't ever try to monopolize the conversation regarding animal exploitation. I don't say what you're talking about is mine, or what I'm talking about is more important, listen to me. I think we can say what you're talking about is awful, this other system's awful, they're both awful, let's destroy them together. And so, yeah, I mean, all my approaches is listening, finding the intersections of both, and then helping to articulate how I see them overlapping, and hopefully winning some support in that way.
I think I'll just hop in a little bit too, is when I've been thinking about abolition work, because I came into social movements from vegan advocacy. So it's just usually very unusual. People usually go from labor or environmental justice and then find out about speciesism. But for me, it was the other way. And so coming into it from speciesism, I started recognizing how systems and structures of violence are so interconnected. And so for me, as a vegan advocate, it felt like it was my responsibility to also work in solidarity with prison abolitionists and be part of those movements themselves. And just by building that solidarity work and seeing that itself as a form of vegan advocacy. Because I think we focus a lot of veganism as a kind of diet, which I usually find kind of self-defeating. I really think of veganism as a praxis or a political framework focused on mutual aid and harm reduction. And so with that perspective, prison abolition itself would be a vegan issue to me.
I think one more thing about how this connected, or how to bring these connections up, I think is also just looking at history. David Neibert wrote really excellently about the history, about how animal oppression both enabled and was driving so much of human violence. So everything from colonialism to violence, from Genghis Khan raiding the Mongolian steppes and the Eurasian steppes to the Roman Empire, etc. It's always, animal oppression is always so central to these ideas. So now when we look about all other forms of human violence, including cultural violence, as we talked about against indigenous people, I feel like just trying to revisit the history and learning and explaining the history and seeing they're connected not just ideologically and not just in the way that we see them today, but actually for thousands of years, animal oppression has been driving so many other forms of oppression and violence. And I think through these connections, I think we can also see like, hey, we're all in this together. We want the same for all of us.
Does anyone else have any other questions or comments?
Yeah, not directly following from the last point, if that's okay.
Of course.
Yeah, I posted about this in the chat, but just in case anyone is not looking at that, or just to elaborate, there is right now in Maryland a Black-led effort to address food injustice in the prison system and to give and to make plant-based foods accessible to prisoners, which is of course especially dire when first of all, prison food is terrible and is driving people to diabetes and other chronic and other illnesses, and is exacerbating the risk factor for people in prison during the COVID epidemic. So there's legislation in the Maryland State Senate and the Maryland State House of Delegates, which would create a pilot program to allow prisoners to allow incarcerated persons to request plant-based foods. There's also components around educating healthcare practitioners so that people in hospitals can be basically prescribed healthy food rather than eating terrible prison food. And so those the bills are SB 322 and HB 1071. If you are in Maryland, there's a longish link in the chat. If you just who represents me in Maryland, it can help you find your elected officials and just let them know that you support this legislation. Maryland has a very short legislative session, so the timing, it's a 3-month legislature, so the timing on this is really critical. But there's a real opportunity to potentially move this year and try to bring food justice into the, well, at least create some level of food justice within the injustice of the prison system.
Thank you so much for sharing.
You're welcome.
All right, I'm going to invite anyone just to have last thoughts then. I know, Nico, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I got some. I mean, I'm an infinite bag of thoughts, but I'll wrap up with a few real quick ones. I guess first, thanks everybody for coming here. As I already said, it's like people who are willing to spend their Sunday afternoons digging into these topics are my favorite people on this planet. So really, like, my heart goes out to y'all. And I really do think like the topics that we're discussing here are incredibly central to the success of this movement moving forward. And I really don't think that can be like overstated. The issues that animal advocates are passionate about and working for, like the same values motivating us, animate so many values on the left. And it's deeply unfortunate that thus far, like animal liberation, animal advocacy has been alienated from the left. And unfortunately, that's happened for like 4 reasons. Like there has been like a lot of misanthropic like motives within the animal movement for time, and just like poor messaging. But I think we as animal advocates, like we really do need to be doing better at reaching, and like I'm speaking to the choir, everybody here agrees, but I guess the plea is for us to be going out into our communities and really helping to galvanize attention on all these other issues, building solidarity with other movements. And I think that the success of all of our movements really are codependent. And so the more we can be building alliances, genuine alliances, not instrumental alliances with other groups, the better we are. And then thanks, y'all. Y'all are beautiful.
Matt, could you read the question in the chat?
Yes, of course. One moment. It says, okay, so there's a couple of them. Let me see.
I think Matt might have frozen. So Laura's question was what can we do to provide a platform for
industries
people
themselves due to their extreme state of
That's going to come back in a second.
Oh, sorry.
You're freezing.
Sorry, guys. Yeah, can you hear me now? Is everything?
Yeah, I'm gonna mute you though.
Freezing.
Going in
Okay,
and out.
sorry about that. Okay.
Sorry, Matt. He's in Egypt. So the question was, what can we do to provide a platform for people who have been exploited by the animal exploitation industries themselves due to their extreme state of marginalization? How can they have a chance to speak on these issues, both to the animal rights movement and to other leftist movements and to the public at large? Because it seems like they're often the absent reference in these conversations. I've been thinking about that a lot lately in this collection, because I've also gotten involved more. I don't know if you all know Anthony Nicole's work. He is a abolition activist, works with critical animal studies, does a ton of collections. Also, I think founded the organization Save the Kids. And with my previous collection with Julia Feliz that I co-edited, we really tried to only raise the voices of those that have been historically marginalized, which is what I try to usually do in my work. We tried to only offer the platform for those who were identified as queer, trans, Black, brown, Indigenous people of color, and then provided stipends to them. With this collection, it is slightly more, most of the contributors are mostly in and outside of academia. And I've really thought about that as a limitation because it is very much very dominated by white voices. Most of us are queer and trans, but we hold an immense amount of privilege. Many of us have not been incarcerated beforehand. And that's something that Anthony Nicola brought up to me, was how do we raise these voices, especially when it's so difficult to have incarcerated folks be able to write in these collections. I've tried before, and it's I don't know if you all know, but like mailing to prisons is really difficult, getting emails, just having conversations in general, and that's all very entrenched in what the prison industrial complex is silencing these voices. So I am super interested in anything about this anyone has to say on how to move forward, especially my own collections.
In my experience of like having a lot of close friends who've experienced the carceral system and related have had to work in animal production, as well as working with people like refugee communities, a lot of those folks have a lot of other things going on and a lot of other issues. So sometimes they don't have the time to be like the frontline speakers. So but you don't want to speak for those folks. So in my experience, the way to like meet people with those voices and like elevate them is to be involved in the things that are impacting them and their communities, right? Like my friends who experienced that, who were incarcerated and now are out, they worked in factory farming, they're more interested in just like their day-to-day life and advocating for other cons to be able to get jobs. The refugee families I knew, like it was parents, and they were more focused on like, how do I sustain a new community? How do I integrate and make friends and like get my children good education? So working with people where they're at, because some folks might not want to necessarily be the spokespeople for the animal rights movement, and that's okay. You know what I mean? Like that's fine. But finding ways to meet folks where they're at and that's part of like doing this intersectional work of anti-oppression, is working with people and being like, are you interested in this? And if you're not, that's fine. Those things can coexist together. But it is incredibly hard to work with folks and get editorials from people while they're in prison, which is definitely for sure by design. But yeah, I think a part of it is meeting people where they're at and, seeing if they're interested. And then if they're not, they're not. And if they are, that's great. But I mean, that's difficult because then the same voices can end up dominating. It's complex. It's a hard issue because you don't want to force people to work on your project. Yeah, it's hard.
Yeah, and I feel like it's difficult to, I'm doing this work as a white, mostly stable financially person. I think a lot about at what point is a performative allyship? At what point is it kind of extractive to try to look for these voices? At what point is it tokenizing? there's obviously not a lot of funding or no funding for the kind of work we do. And even in the collection, I applied for so many grants to be able to reimburse contributors. And I received one for like $500 that's going to go to folks who identify as BIPOC populations. But I really, especially when you're asking people to be open about their own lived experience and their trauma, like you said, Laura, that should be something that they are completely reimbursed to, especially when you're learning from folks who have been historically marginalized. And right now, since, I mean, even these conversations are kind of the undercurrent, right? We're like, I'm writing this with the audience in mind of white NGOs that on how they can be less trash, right? Because so many organizations I've worked for are just super problematic. And I've been isolated for that. I've been pushed out of organizations. It's very difficult for me to find a job as someone who's openly trans. And so I wish there was funding available. And this is really where I want to see the movement go towards, is making sure that we can reimburse these voices. And so I like that all the conversations we've had here, especially thinking about how we can continue these conversations into the future, because these are things that I know I'm going to be thinking about for months, if not years. And I'm sure we can all build on each other's work here and collaborate. Any last words for everyone? Thank you so much for being part of this conversation. I'm going to email everyone with like reading lists that we mentioned today, as well as post I'm going to post this on YouTube and give out the YouTube links so that you can share with your friends, your colleagues, your accomplices. And yes, it's critical to support BIPOC-led organizing efforts. Black vegans are one of the largest growing groups of veganism. And the most transformative work is being done and led by BIPOC folks. So always, if you can financially support them, please do. We're also going to be sending out writing from Black feminists who have been talking about this for decades. I'm new to it, but the work is not. So thank you all for being here, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye, everyone.
Thank you all so much. Bye-bye.